In January 2016, China finally announced the end of its controversial one-child policy, first rolled out in 1980. For the first time in almost 40 years, all couples were allowed to have up to 2 children. The key objective back then was to halt and possibly reverse the steep decline in the birth rates in the world's most populous nation.
I guess government was initially hoping that this two-child policy was going to be sufficient in raising the fertility rate, but the result wasn't there and they started to get more nervous.
The fertility rate kept falling drastically, down to 1.3 per woman, far below the replacement rate of 2.1 needed to maintain a stable population.
I believe there was a spike in the birth rate immediately following, but the effect quickly dissipated after a few years.
In May this year, China scrapped its two-child policy in favor of a three-child policy to try and arrest the rapid fall in birth rates. But getting parents to change their mindset will not be easy.
就是来的有点晚了，身边的朋友还是少数会考虑2胎3胎，大家都觉得这个压力已经很大了。
这个我是不会去改变我的想法的，无论说国家给予这个多胎开放，还有以及一些生育补贴或者一些东西的话。
Will the drastic policy shift lead to a rapid surge in the fertility rate? With fewer babies, coupled with the rapid increase in the number of elderly citizens, will that mark the end of China's phenomenal economic growth and hinder its rise as the next global superpower? It's Monday afternoon in Beijing. 38-year-old Zhang Rui and her husband, 37-year-old Qiang Zihe, are enjoying a game of basketball with their son, Zhuang Zhuang, at a playground just a stone's throw from their apartment. Since Zhuang Zhuang was born 8 years ago, he has brought joy and love to the family. The birth of their second child 4 years later has made their lives even more complete. But Zhang and Qiang are not the typical Chinese couple, especially in an urban and highly competitive city like Beijing. Many of the city dwellers here do not believe in having a large family, but not Zhang Rui and her husband. They've already been blessed with 2 kids. Now they're planning to have another one.
其实我们俩还是比较喜欢孩子的。当时，生完第1个以后呢，其实第2个也不是计划中的，但是呢，既然有了，那就顺其自然的给他生下来了。
反正第1个肯定是相对来说，当时就是没有经验嘛，肯定最开始也是就是手忙脚乱的吧，就可能好多事儿也不知道该干什么或者该怎么去做，完了。 有第2个以后就觉得反正就没有那么大压力了，就比较就轻松吧，可能也是可能因为有经验吧。
但是其实2胎来说，我觉得一是很有经验了，然后呢，就会顺手很多，而且我们俩都是真的是很喜欢孩子，所以就是非常享受，就是把一个那么小的小人养那么大的这个过程，我觉得还是很享受的，所以就是还是挺想要3胎的。
In a major city like Beijing, with a population of 21 million people,
it was a struggle for us to find a couple with 2 children. It was near mission impossible for us to find a couple with 3 children or thinking of having a 3rd one.
That's the reason why, when Qiang Zihe and his wife Zhang Rui told their friends that they wanted to have a 3rd child, many of them were surprised.
觉得要2胎都有点不可思议。
因为我的朋友主要都是男性为主嘛，肯定也会聊过这个问题。说实话，大部分可能觉得我这个决定还是挺勇敢的。
我觉得像我们以后肯定是会走在孩子前面的，那给他多一个陪伴，就是相当于他们现在是兄弟姐妹嘛。我觉得几个兄弟姐妹有血缘关系，他们肯定会，以后彼此互相扶持啊，互相照顾啊。我觉得这一点来说，也是我比较坚定要3胎的理由。
But not many people in China today share the same sentiment. And that's especially true for those who've become largely accustomed to the country's strict one-child policy. The policy remained in force for decades until it was finally scrapped 6 years ago. How did the people react to the policy back then? China's national birth control policy began in 1980 during the premiership of China's paramount leader Deng Xiaoping. China then recorded a rapid population growth. From 540 million in 1949, its population grew to 969 million in 1980. That's when the controversial and draconian one-child policy came into effect. The move was found to be the most effective way of reducing the country's explosive population growth. Those who flouted the law were often met with severe punishments, including fines and forced abortions. Even civil servants risked losing their jobs if they were found to have more than one child. And the driving force of the introduction of the policy was purely economic.
At that time, China's population growth rate was 2.5%. And as we all know, at that time, China was very, very poor. The poverty problem was horrendous. In 1979, Mr. Deng Xiaoping wanted to jumpstart the economic reform. So that's exactly when economic reform happened. So one-child policy is to facilitate the economic reform, and so that the poverty will not drag the country down, the economic reform down.
I think around the time 1980 and before, internationally there was a lot of concern about overpopulation as a hindrance to economic development, resulting in all kinds of environmental problems, shortages of food. The way to prosperity would be to enforce one-child policy. So of course this took various forms, from sterilizations to birth control, abortion.
Not having another child is one of Zhuang Qiuyuan and Zheng Zhiling's biggest regrets in life. After their daughter was born, they were eager to have another child. Zhuang was, in fact, pregnant with her second child. But there was simply too high a price to be paid if they were found to have flouted the one-child policy back then in the 1980s. They had to face a stiff financial penalty. They also had to endure tremendous pressure from the authorities should they decide to keep the baby. In the end, the couple made a very painful decision to end the pregnancy.
当时想是肯定是想要2个的，因为2个的话肯定是有个伴嘛，是不是？如果要生第2胎的话，当时的那个社会抚养费也是挺高的，20几万，所以当时我们就生了1个。那个时候肯定是愿意的，当时如果说有可以开放2胎的话，我们当时会愿意生1个的。那时候如果因为之前有试过1次，有意外也怀过1次嘛，但是也是因为政策不允许，然后如果真的是生下来的话，会压力很大，就没有要了嘛。
We do hear lots of horror stories about forced abortion and even killing of the female babies, especially in the countryside. And all this resulted in heavily skewed sex ratio in China's population.
And now it's simply too late for them to turn back the clock.
其实想是想了，但相对说，主要是我们年龄也有一定的岁数，然后体能啊、精力啊， 可能还跟不上，所以就比较算是人生的一个遗憾吧。
Total fertility rate, or TFR, is the measure of the number of children a woman will have in her lifetime. In 1980, China's TFR was 2.61, and that number of babies was considered too many mouths to feed and an obstacle on the country's path to prosperity.
其实在一个1978年的期间哈，当时我们国家的人口大概有10亿个人口哈，当时来说，其实对国家来讲是在粮食方面，还有其他一个有关劳动力过剩的问题，对咱们国家来说是有一个压力的。
With economic prosperity as the goal of the nation, the One-Child Policy was imposed with great efficiency. Just 15 years after the birth control plan was enforced, by 1995, China's TFR plunged from 2.61 to 1.66, well below the universally accepted replacement rate of 2.1, which meant the One-Child Policy was successful, ironically, too successful for its own good.
And so that was the birth of One-Child Policy. I would say it's very simple-minded and too simple-minded and did not take into account many of the perhaps unintended consequences that the country is dealing with now.
In the decades that followed, China's TFR hovered at the 1.6 range, a far cry from the ideal 2.1. The unintended consequences could no longer be ignored, nor the macro implications on the social-economic fabric of China.
有一个很大一个变化，过去来说，我们就是那个年轻人就相对来说是比较多哈，所以从这个生产力我们就可以照顾这个老人家年轻的，因为我们那个出生率刚刚那个数字就是只有1200万从这个数字再过，比方说20年、30年之后，我们一方面老化了，可是我们年轻的人口相对来说还是比较少，所以小的有生产力的去照顾比较老没有生产力的，从这个经济的结构来说是带来一个很大的影响。
So, in 2015, after some 35 years of the One-Child Policy, China relaxed the law to allow couples to have 2 children.
Were there more babies born with the loosening of the rules? Was the Chinese government equally successful with the 2-child policy as they had been with the 1-child policy?
At that time, we did see a small increase in birth in the first year when it was first relaxed. But then consecutively after that, it has been a decline in birth rate, and the largest decline, of course, is this last year, 2020, when the government announced that the fertility was 1.3. So overall, I would say the impact is very small. And so far, we have not seen a big increase in infertility.
In the ensuing years since 1980, China has been the fastest growing economy in the world, with an average annual growth rate of 10% from 1978 to 2005. In 2010, China surpassed Japan to become the world's second largest economy. Some estimates suggest that China will overtake the world's biggest economy, the US, by 2028. But as its economic development soared, China's fertility rate continued to plunge.
After overturning almost half a century's policy of birth control, is it too late to break the mindset of a generation that has been indoctrinated to believe that fewer children, not more, is the definition of a better life?
就是来的有点晚了，身边的朋友还是少数会考虑2胎、3胎，大家都觉得这个压力已经很大了。